my friend Alona, who's here, suggested, because she came with me 3 years ago when we brought this portrait of me done by Granby, my grandmother, Blanche Ames, and I thought it should be here, not any longer in my house. So she suggested it come downstairs from the 3rd floor studio, Granby's studio. So it's here. And I remember this vividly. I was 10. I remember the dress. I remember having to sit very still. And I loved that she had water. And I want to say that my beloved cousin, Oakes Plimpton, is here. His mother was another of the 4 children. And they had to make a decision about what would happen to these 1,200 acres and this incredible mansion. And the decision was made to sell it somewhat, but give it basically to the state of Massachusetts to become a state park. And I just want to say it makes me teary to think about that decision, because now thousands of people come and enjoy this place that we used to come to as grandchildren. We had no idea you don't know when you're 7 or 8. You sort of assume, oh, this is the way things are. Well, they aren't. It's like, what? So I just want to say how much joy it fills our family to know that this decision was made and there was somebody who wanted to develop it. Can you imagine? And there wouldn't be this great wild resource that you're all enjoying. So I just want to start there. That felt so important to tell you. All right, let me share a few memories of coming here. And I don't even know where to start. It's really funny. I think I should probably start by just describing what it felt like when I knew I was coming as a child. There was this feeling of anticipation, of excitement. Invariably, there were my cousins here, and so there were a lot of youngsters playing around. And it was just an incredible place to come, because I hope most of you have had a chance to do a house tour at some point, but everywhere you look, there's something intriguing. You know, there's the glass case with all the stuffed birds in it. There's a chest in a back hall that has all these drawers with butterflies from all over the world. I used to love that chest and look in there. And of course, most of the artwork around here was done by our grandmother, who was so incredibly gifted. I'll say a little bit more about her in a minute. But so to come here, you know, there was the tennis court, there was the swimming pool, there were the lakes, there were all these places to hike and explore. And so one of the most cherished memories was of something we called the jalopy. Do you remember, Oakes?
Yes.
So it was a broken down, not broken down in the sense of it didn't work, it worked really well. It was an old Model T Ford that Granby had taken all of it apart, so there was a platform. It was so she could, I won't go into the details, so she could experiment with one of her inventions. And so here was, visualize this, an old Model T with only an engine in the front and 2 bucket seats and then a platform. And I want you to know, it had a gear shift. I want you to know that what were we? I don't know, 12, 14 grandchildren learned how to drive on that jalopy. And I want you to know there were no seat belts. We sat loose on the platform in the back while one of our cousins was learning how to drive. And I cannot understand how it was that there were no accidents. We were, in fact, I get such a thrill thinking about this because we were trusted to just roam free in this place. We'd go to meals and we'd have to sit with our grandparents then, but most of the time we were out and about and on that jalopy. And the only time I remember my sister backed into a tree, but fortunately, nobody was hurt. So anyway, that's a memorable part of our past, all of us. I mean, all of us knew how to drive a gear shift, it's a tricky word, a shift car when we were about 11 or 12 years old. So pretty awesome. So let me briefly describe my grandparents because they presided over this house. And my grandfather, Grando, Oakes was his name, so he was Grand O. Very shy, really totally reserved, very quiet. He didn't really connect with children at all unless we showed interest in botany or orchids. That's because he was a botanist and a world-famous orchidologist. And so he would be sitting here. There used to be a big desk in the middle of this room. That maybe is it. And in that alcove was his microscope, and you'd see him bending over, studying some specimen. And this was his domain. This was his library. It was the reason the house was built out of stone, not wood, so that this wouldn't burn down. And so the floors are cement. And I want to say, well, I'll tell you one story about Grando, which I never forgot. I was probably 10, and I was sitting at that grand table in the dining room, and I had my elbows on the table. And I didn't notice it, but he picked up his knife, he turned it around, and he whacked my elbow with the handle of that knife. He didn't say a word. I never put my elbows on a table again. There were, what should I say? We were expected to have good manners. So anyway, it was my grandmother who presided over the conversations at that table. So let me say a word about her. There is, I want to say, where are you, Kevin? Are you back there? Kevin Friend, who was wonderful and came today, has, and maybe many of you seen it, done the most brilliant film called Borderland. And I think it has a subtitle, but I can't remember what it is.
The Life and Times of Blanche Ames.
Oh, The Life and Times of Blanche Ames. And it's just beautifully done. And why am I mentioning? I just wanted you to know about it because it's now available on, is it Netflix?
It's on YouTube.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So you can see it. Well, anyways, just briefly, from my perspective, Granby B for Blanche, and the Ames, she was not related to my grandfather. It was a big scattered family. She was a paragon. She was a powerhouse. She was a Renaissance woman. On and on I could go. She was a leader of the suffrage movement. She was an inventor. She was a self-taught botanical artist and illustrated all of my grandfather's books. There was nothing that she wouldn't take on. And in fact, when this house was being built back in I don't know what Oaks, 8 to 10, something like that, she didn't like what the architects were doing, so she fired them, and she took over. And in those days, very few houses had electricity. But she learned how electrical systems worked, and she made sure this house was electrified. And furthermore, plumbing was kind of rudimentary back in those days, but no, she learned about plumbing. So this was a person who she became, you could go on and on about her. She believed she was the daughter of a general. That might have had something to do with it. Of course, reminding me. General Adelbert Ames, who was appointed Reconstruction governor of Mississippi, and that's a whole big story. But in any case, she was brought up with these values that you could do anything that you wanted to do, anything you put your mind to. And so that was expected of us. And when we came here, for instance, if you played the piano, you were expected to perform. If you were taught how to do artwork. So most of us knew how to draw and to paint because that's the sort of thing she kept passing on. So were very high standards that were being asked of. And that left me with some legacy issues, I have to say. But let me tell you a couple more stories. I want to tell you I have to see if I can remember here where I am. Hold on a second. Well, I'm thinking about, I'll tell you one more story about her that my brother Ned tells that, I have to tell you this about her. This is a big, long story, but when Kennedy wrote Profiles of Courage, he made rather disparaging remarks about Delbert Ames, and she was incensed, and she wrote to him, and because our oldest cousin, George Plimpton, was good friends with the Kennedys, her letters got to Kennedy's desk, and she wrote to him and she said, you took the perspectives of Southern historians. They were distorted, they hated anything to do with Reconstruction, and she said, in your future books, you must correct what you have written because it's incorrect. That she took him on. But he wrote back and said there wouldn't be any more editions. So anyway, she set about in her 80s to write the story of her father. And I want to say I came here, there were tables set up, books everywhere. She did a very thorough job. And when she'd written about 500 pages, my father came to visit her son. And my father said, Mother, how long is your book now? And she said, well, it's slightly over 500 pages. And my father said, well, don't you think that's enough? And she pulled herself up, looked him straight in the eye, and said, if Tolstoy could do it, so can I. That was her. That was, and that book, by the way, ended up being 564 pages long. And I knew, I was in the field then, that American historians were very respectful of the incredible job that she had done, written in her mid-80s. So what a role model that was. I'll tell one more story that tells you about her. My brother Ned was coming back from his service in the Marine Corps, and he was stopped on one of the roads in. He couldn't proceed because they were redoing a bridge. And so I got out of the car, see what was happening, and there was about a 6-foot hole. And Granby, who was then 81, was down in that hole, and she was telling the road workers how to put in the rebars, or whatever you call them. So she had no qualms about telling people what to do. She was an authority figure. She was a powerful woman. So anyway, that gives you a little feeling about her. So let me see here. I think this is where I want to do a segue into, just saying in conclusion, what an extraordinary and almost magical place I think this is. And one of you asked me when I came here this morning, how did it feel to be here today? And I want to say it feels different than any other time because I'll tell you why. I was here 3 years ago when we brought the portrait back, but in the meanwhile, I've written my third book, which is a memoir. And it's a very powerful experience to write a memoir. I want to encourage any of you, whether you're writers or not, but maybe who are a little bit further down the road of life, to think about this, because when I first heard about life review, I was only in my 60s. I was way too young. I couldn't quite wrap my head around that one. But the title of that workshop I was invited to co-teach was called Telling Our Stories, Life Review, and Spiritual Autobiography. And that's when I think something dropped into my head, like, oh, that's an interesting prospect. So anyways, what began to happen was, I'll give a little of my background so you have some context, but my friends, well, I better give you the context right away, which is that I've always been very curious, even from the time that I was a child, by some really big questions, like, who am I? And who are you? And I don't think I thought about the meaning of life when I was a child, but I could certainly look back and see that I was filled with wonder about so many things. And most people didn't talk about them. And in fact, I had this very, maybe unusual impulse, which was to ask, why am I in here and you're in there? And why can't I get out of here and get into there and feel what that would be like? I did wonder about that when I was a child. So this is some intimation of my being somebody who was contemplative, reflective, who eventually got drawn into the fields of psychology and meditation. Two fields that have been actually my life's work, shall we say, as mainly teaching and writing. So it's been a lifelong journey to answer some of those questions, like, what is it all about? And so when we get to where I am, which is in my late 80s, it's really a profound exercise to think about, what was this about? And so I've come back here today after not having been here only 3 years ago, and I'm experiencing it differently because I've done such deep reflection about many things, including family legacy, because I had to deal with that issue. And that's about 2 chapters in the book. One of them is called The Family Tree. Another one has to do with something that happened in this room. Amazing story. I won't tell it to you, it's in the book. But I could never have guessed it. I'll tell you this much. When I came back that day with a small group of people, a dear, dear beloved friend who I was in a group with, including Penny, although she wasn't in the group then. But I want you to know that among other things that happened, I stood here with my arms outstretched like that, and I spoke to my ancestors, and I said, I want you to know who I am, because I was drawn to such a different path. My ancestors were, many of them, leaders, public servants, governors, generals, senators. They were in my history books. I didn't know how to relate to that because that wasn't my call. They were entrepreneurs. In fact, one of you asked me, where did the wealth come from in this family? Well, they were originally blacksmiths who came from England. They were metal workers, and they started a shovel factory. Those of you who live in Northeastern know well that the headquarters were there of the Ames shovel factory, which became the biggest shovel factory in the world at a time when everything was done with shovels. The building of railroads, the building of roads, there was no heavy machinery, so they were entrepreneurs, and that's where this came from. So let me come to tell you a little bit more about the book. I just mentioned the segue part, and I want to say that there are several key themes. I have to have notes because there's so much to say, but I want to say that I'll start with the title of the book. The working title, while I was writing, was always Adventures Along the Spiritual Path, because I've been called to the mystery, to understand the mystery in which we live. And that led me into the world of the mysterious, of the invisible, of that which cannot be measured. And all of this is very countercultural, because we live in a culture that is very secular, very materialistic, very based and rooted in a scientific paradigm. And so often there's very deep suspicion of that which cannot be explained rationally. That's all that really interests me. Not all, but that's something that intrigues me. So I wanted to understand basic things like how do we find happiness in life, and how do we deal with the challenges of life. And so, of course, I got drawn into psychology and meditation. So back to the title, where did it come from? As I said, there was this working title, but I kept thinking, isn't there a more poetic title? There must be a more poetic title. So I thought, well, I'll write a conclusion to the book, which I called a postlude. And I sat down, and in one morning, I wrote just 2.5 pages. I opened, in a sense, to what I had done, which was over a year or so, write this memoir. And there were the themes of interconnection, the themes of relationship, personal, family, spiritual. And there were those wonderful stories about synchronicities, about the most impossible things that seem to have happened. And this is why my friends kept saying, when are you going to write your stories? When are you going to write your stories? And so I finally sat down and started to do it. So, but I still didn't have that poetic title. And then I remembered one chapter, which is called Psychics and Findhorn. And have any of you heard of Findhorn? Yes, a few of you. So Findhorn was an eco-spiritual community that started in the 60s. And here we go. How did it start? Because 2 women were receiving guidance from other dimensions. Don't you love it? Not scientific at all, but the guidance was very clear. It was start a community where people work with love, where there is a garden. A garden? This was northern Scotland, not very likely place for a garden. But because of what they did there, it became so famous that people began coming from all over the world to see this new community. And I went there 10 years later, 1977, and this is when I first heard the term ley lines. And I've often thought people think I don't know how to spell, because it's spelled L-E-Y. It's not spelled L-A-Y. And so I tell this story of how it connects to my first psychic reading, yes, and how when I was doing my job, one of my fellow workmen used this phrase, ley lines, and he explained that in the early indigenous peoples of North Europe, they were still in touch with the land, and they could feel the energy lines on the Earth's surface. And where those lines cross, those are power points. And that's where the great cathedrals are built, because those cathedrals were built mainly in the 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th century, and people had not become so disconnected from Mother Earth, which, alas, we have, but fortunately are connecting back to. So as I was writing along, this conclusion, out of my hand came this phrase, ley lines of love. And I went, that's the title. And I felt it was given to me. It felt like it didn't come through this. I mean, I don't know the mystery of these things, but I love the title because I think we are all so interconnected through our love for each other, our it has many challenges and problems, and it's like all the karma of our lives, but it's this beautiful image, really, of interconnection. And then one of the Buddhist, I didn't say the two traditions that I have practiced in the most, many, many years, like 50. One is Vedanta from India. Vedanta is a part of Hinduism. And then I kind of migrated into the Buddhist tradition, and I've practiced in two different, shall we say, traditions within Buddhism. That's for any of you who might be interested in that part. But anyways, to just tell you about a few of the main themes in the book. First of all, I think, as you might have guessed so far, the centrality of the inner journey. This was really the call of this life, and very different from these ancestors that I was telling you about. And that's why I had to do some inner work about how do I relate to all of that that I came from, for which I am tremendously grateful. And yet I was called in a very different direction. So a second major theme in the book is the longing for inner freedom. And you might wonder, what in the world do I mean by that? I mean, the term often used is self-realization, capital S, self, that which is beyond the little self, beyond the ego. Our sense, and you all know it, of those moments when you are so absorbed in something that your sense of I vanishes. You become one, maybe it's in nature, maybe it's sometimes walking in this park. Those moments when there's a feeling of wholeness, of well-being, that all is well with me and with life, and yet sometimes there's still a little more longing for something more, the sense there's something more. And the answer is yes, there is. And it dwells within our own hearts. And it involves some kind of practice, something absorbing that allows us to connect with that deepest part of ourselves. And so I was led, thanks to a beloved older friend who gave me a book when I was in my 30s. And the book was called The Way of the White Clouds by Lama Govinda. And it may sound like an exaggeration that a book changed my life, but this book did. And you could say, well, how? How could that be? Well, it's because I read about a great master whose name was Domo Geshe Rinpoche. You don't have to remember that. He was Tibetan. And Lama Govinda describes what it's like to come into the presence of somebody who is fully enlightened. It's an amazing experience. There's a difference. There's something you feel. There's a quiet magnetism. You want to be near. You want to be, he said that when the Rinpoche, the teacher, put his hand on his head, he said, bliss poured through my body and everything went out of my mind. I was in bliss. Well, that's unusual, but in any case, I read this and I thought, I've got to find enlightened teachers, and that became a search. And there are many, many people who are on, if you could say, the road to enlightenment. We all are, in a certain sense, and it's a relative matter, but that was where I was drawn. And actually, it led me to go to India 6 times. I spent most of that time in an ashram, which is a spiritual center. I just wanted to do the practices. I just wanted to be steeped in that culture, in that country, where some of this is still very alive, and where you can go and experience it. And that's what I did whenever I could. So part of this is that I was always looking for inspiration, so that's one way that I found it. And so I want to say that the book, Ley Lines of Love, is woven with, I think, inspiring stories and what I call wisdom traditions. No, wisdom teachings. Wisdom teachings. What can I say? I feel I've been so fortunate that I just want to share the fruits of what has been discovered. That's the impulse behind writing or behind speaking. So let me just tell you a couple of examples from this book, not from my book, but just basically a spiritual memoir. So here are a couple of stories that appear in it. I read in another book, I'm very influenced by books, you can imagine growing up in this place. I read the word vigil. I didn't know much about it, but I thought, vigil. I read that William James, our famous philosopher around the turn of the century, had spent the night in vigil on Mount Marcy in New York State. And that planted a seed. I thought, I want to do something like that. So I spent a night on the highest mountain in our valley in Vermont, Mount Abraham. If any of you are skiers, it's Sugar Bush or Mad River. It's about 4,000 feet, and I went up there. Well, I won't tell you the whole story. It's in the book. But it was a very, very important experience for me. I might say in those days there were no cell phones. I went up there alone. There were bears, there were mountain lions, there were other things. Anyways, I had to deal with a lot of very primal feelings of being up there alone in the night. Anyway, that's a story that I tell. So another story that goes back to this yearning that I had as a child it's like, I wanted to know what it was like to be you. So I had a big dream. There are several big dreams in this book because with my psychological training, of course, big dreams, Carl Jung called them great dreams, can be as vivid and powerful as this reality of us sitting here together. And so in this dream, I won't tell you the details except that I became so terrified that I went shooting out of my body. I went through the roof of wherever I was. I left my body. And I want to tell you that I came back. I'm here to say I came back. But it really changed my perception of reality. It made me realize that we are consciousness beyond the physical body. This is really important to know. I was drawn into hospice work, and that it's the consciousness that dies. No, sorry, the body dies, the consciousness continues. That's a very debatable question, but I'm sure most of you know that most Eastern traditions just take multiple lives and reincarnation for granted. It's just an assumption. Anyways, it's a big topic, but I tell that story because it really changed me. That dream changed me. So I'll tell another story quickly. My goodness, I want to leave some time for questions. This is such an amazing story. I have a very dear niece whose name is Elena. I took her to this ashram that I was then involved with, and she had this initiation, this tradition involved an initiation, an awakening of spiritual energy in the body. And she had such a powerful awakening that she went into kind of ecstasies like Mother Teresa of Lisieux or some of these medieval mystics that you hear about. And she was possessed by this energy. And to make a long story short, she came back, she had to come, she said, I have to come to your house. She said, I can't be in my my apartment because the pictures of the masters are so powerful. I keep having these tremendous waves of energy. She couldn't eat, she couldn't sleep. She walked into my house and she came into a hallway where there was a picture of my father, and in the background of that picture was a picture of my mother. She, Elena, had never met my mother. They had never met. My mother was in a nursing home on Long Island. We were in Cambridge. And my mother had Alzheimer's, and she hadn't spoken in 2 years. She was very near death. Elena stopped in front of this picture. She said, "Your mother is talking to me. Your mother wants you to come. Your mother wants the whole family to come now." I just about freaked out. It's like, what is this? Well, I chose to listen to her because, in fact, she was at that time clairaudient and clairvoyant. In other words, she could experience guidance beyond time and space. I'm still shake my head at this. I can only tell, so she said, it has to be soon. And the reason that she said that was because 3 weeks later, she had moved out of this state and she could no longer have done this. So we did meet with my mother, and that story is told. And Elena orchestrated that meeting because my mother was still speaking to her. I tell you, that 3 weeks of my life was incredible. So of course I had to tell that story. So I'll tell very briefly one last story. It's a very major part of the book because many people in my sort of generation, well, way beyond my generation, who've been spiritual seekers have come up against the shadow of the tradition. It's always around 3 big things: power, money, and sex. Abuses along those lines. And we know what we've heard from various churches, the tremendous upheavals in the Catholic Church for one, but look anywhere and this happens. Well, this came into our family in a very powerful way. And I had to tell this story, even though it concerned my beloved daughter, who ended up in the inner circle of a worldwide meditation tradition with thousands of devotees. When she got in the inner circle, she learned what was really going on. And she ended up being in an abusive situation. She was really temporarily broken by it. I had to tell this because we have to acknowledge the shadow that people have, that organizations have. I don't care who you're talking about, we're all human. And so it was, for me, it was an initiation into the darkness, and it was as valuable as the initiation into the light had been. And it took me 2 years to recover, because there's something about when your inner life, your spiritual life, is blown apart like that. It's a kind of pain that's almost inconceivable. So anyways, let me conclude now by saying, oh boy, how am I going to conclude? I feel like I was so drawn to share these stories by writing the book. And so they're there for anybody who wants to hear them. And I feel that this life has been a tremendous blessing. And hopefully, you know, I've been able to share some of those blessings through writing and through teaching. And I want to bring it back to this place and to these people who planted seeds of how you can do what you want to do, what you're called to do. Do it. Just do it. And I can almost hear them saying, yes, yes, go for it, because life is so precious and it's so short. And since I've come here this morning, it's felt very dreamlike between seeing this wonderful I mean, that was painted when I was 10. And here I am, 87. It's like unreal. It's like a dream. And you know, the wisdom traditions tell us this is a dream. It's very real. Anyways, I want to end there. I want to thank you for your attention. And let's open it up for any questions. Thank you so much. Alona, I think you better come up. I'm quite hearing impaired, so I probably won't be able to so Alona, my beloved friend, is going to translate any questions you have. Any questions about this place, whatever? I want to put on my Roger stick. Hold on. Yeah. Are there things that you've always wanted to know about this house or about these people? Oh, there's something back there. Can you go get it? I mean, can you hear it?
When you stayed here, as a child, where did you sleep? Did all the grandchildren sleep in the same area? Did you have certain beds that you slept in?
What bedroom did I sleep in?
Child?
Yeah. Mainly on the third floor, sort of the farthest away from the master bedroom. But when I was sent here when I was 5. It was my second traumatic experience in this lifetime. I had whooping cough, and my sister had just been born, and my family didn't want her to get it, so they sent me away. And they sent me here alone. I get teary just talking about it. And I lived in the bedroom that's on the second floor in the back. That was Aunt Evie's room, my father's sister's room. I remember it vividly, and I was so scared. This was a terribly hard place to be as a lonely child and very, very sick. So but otherwise, we were up on the third floor, and there were sleeping porches. So sometimes we slept on the sleeping porches. Yeah. Thank you for asking that. Yeah. And so there were great tennis matches out here. And I want to say that Oakes, who's sitting here, named after his grandfather, was a brilliant tennis player. And so I remember you winning a lot of games out here. I bow to you. So there was tennis. There was, we were on the lake a lot, fishing and exploring all those little inlets. And I mean, what a place to go. And sometimes we would spend the night down at the lodge, which is at the edge of the lake. And I can remember fires there and toasting marshmallows there. And then that was so different from sitting at that dining room table with those high-back chairs. And I'll tell you, we had silver goblets for our water. And I can remember drawing, I probably got the back of Grando's knife for that one too, drawing pictures in the condensation on those silver goblets. I mean, can you believe it? I can't believe it. So, any other questions? Yeah.
I'm just curious, all these books, where did they all come from? And did you have access to read any that you chose to?
I didn't get it.
Where did the books come from, and did you have access to them, to read them?
So where did the books come from, and did we have access to read them? I can't really answer that. He was a lifelong collector. Do you know the answer, Oakes?
Well,
Will this go far enough?
the buyer,
Do you remember?
yeah, there was a put a thing in the books saying that he had given the books.
Oh.
Which was an oddity.
Ah.
My grandfather.
Okay. Well, it was a lifelong. Well, they were here. I mean, when I came as a child, this place was all filled up with books, and the answer is yes. We had access to them. And another thing, that's really interesting is that Grando kept a journal every day. And they're all back there, and they are starting to be transcribed. A huge project, because I think there are about 75 of them. So he really kept track of what was going on. It must be an amazing that he did that. But you know, there were no televisions in those days. It was a very different time. We had to be so creative. We didn't even think about it, you know. No cell phones, no televisions, hardly radio. It was radio. Anyway, any more questions? I'm gonna have to, you have to get it.
On the tour guide for the house,
I think they would say, every one of us has gifts. They're very different. But whatever your gifts are, go for it and develop it as fully as you can. And it may be that that gift is a subtle one, like kindness to people, or taking care of animals, or it could be anything. But I think they would say, life is precious, and live it to the fullest. I think that might be the message. That's certainly a message I got from my parents. And because we were very fortunate, we could pursue things that maybe others couldn't. No, everything's possible. There are wonderful stories about kind of background people have come from and where they've ended up. So I think that would be their message. Life is precious. Live it to the fullest. Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you. I think I'll be contemplating that one.
I have a quick question. In walking into the woods, I know there's a lot of Native American energies in there, and did the family, as you were walking around, did you acknowledge that and learn a little bit more about that? Do you have any?
I can't really answer that. All I can tell you is that there was a lot of respect for Native American peoples and knowing that we were living on their land. And I think that the tremendous legacy that's in this family of knowing a lot about the natural world. We were all brought up to know how to identify trees and plants and flowers and fish and moths and butterflies. It's like everywhere there were books that told you how to find out more about something. And there was, and in fact, I'll tell you a sweet story that my brother Ned told me. Over there, outside, I don't know if it's still there used to be an ice house, because in the early days they cut ice from the pond and brought it in to keep food cold. And that ice house was very intriguing to us because it was the ice blocks were covered with sawdust. And the frogs loved to live there. So my brother Ned, who was very much of a naturalist, actually I think of you as a naturalist too, Oaks, decided he wanted to go into the ice house, but it was locked. So he found a high window, and he went in the window, jumped down to the the sawdust-covered ice blocks, and collected frogs. Well, after a few hours, he was missed. And his older brother, also named Oaks, said, I think Ned might be in the ice house. So my father went down and unlocked the ice house and indeed released Ned with his frogs. And when he came to dinner that night, my grandmother said to him, Ned, we have a lot of admiration for your curiosity, but we don't think much of your judgment. I just love that story. And so, we were being educated all the time about how to be, hopefully, living more wisely. I love that story. There's one back there.
What were holidays like here?
What were holidays like here?
I didn't spend them here. I like Christmas, I honestly can't answer you. We were here mostly in the summer, the warmer months. Yeah. I have no experience of that. The only tradition I know that came down was that Christmas trees should have white lights. And when I married Hob, my husband, his family had colored lights. That was an issue for us for a while. Otherwise, I don't know. Yeah. But I want to say, it was such a different way of life. This house has a servant's wing. And we were served at that table that you can see that dining room table. But I used to love to go into the kitchen because I loved the informality and I loved all those folks. And, that way of life is long gone. But that's what we experienced when we were kids coming here. It's like, who sits at a table and gets waited on now? No. So anyway, I look back on that with sort of mixed feelings. Yeah, I don't like the feelings of difference and separation that it creates, but I wanted to be in that kitchen. That was where I was anyway. Maybe one more question?
Sorry, I was just wondering, did your father bring any of those formalities to your home? Or was it much different in your home?
Was my home very different?
Did your father bring any of the formalities to your home?
No, I wouldn't say so because we grew up during the war and there was rationing and there were real shortages. I hardly ever went in a car because gas was rationed, and I didn't see my first movie until I was 13 because we couldn't go to the nearby town. And we had a vegetable garden and we did all the work. Well, I have to say that in those earlier days, my mother did have often a cook helper, so that's a vestige of it for sure. But no, we were brought up to clean up after meals, do the dishes, all of that. So the answer is it changed dramatically with the next generation. Wow. Yeah. It's interesting to think about that. Yeah. Thank you. And any other questions? I know you're mostly interested in this place.
Comment that your grandparents would be so proud of you. Standing here talking.
Oh. That's so sweet of you. Thank you. Well, just speaking, because it's a sort of a link back to the book, I really had to deal with the issues of this background because, well, I'll just give you this littlest example. Oakes's older brother, George Plimpton, had a very different response to this whole thing. He was quite illustrious in his own way, as Oakes was, and George brought the whole Celtics team out here. The whole Celtics team. In a million years, I would never have done that. I didn't talk about this part of my background because I didn't want it to separate me from people. I just wanted to connect with people. And I thought, so I didn't bring people here. And it just shows you, he didn't have those issues at all. So we all have our own ways of dealing with our family conditioning. And we all have it, I don't need to tell you. And for me, that's why I had to address this in the book and why it led to this very dramatic scene in this room, which I see. Dear Jennifer, I have to introduce you. Jennifer Browdy, sitting here in the front row, is my editor. And I only met her for the first... She's a star. I only met her for the first time today because we've been working online. And it's been a total joy. I want to say she's an editor and a writer, and she has a fabulous website. I want to say every week almost you send out notices It's called Writing to Write the World. And she's also a brilliant photographer. So I keep saying, I can't read another one. But these beautiful, beautiful photos appear with whatever she mails out. So,
I'm also your publisher.
oh, she's also my publisher. That's right. Oh, well, yeah, I made a very important decision. I don't think I ever told you this, but my previous two publishers were Torture Penguin, which is a big, big house, and then Monkfish. And I went, when I knew that I was going to write this memoir, I went, I can't be bothered to take all the time they would take to read it and maybe reject it. I just want to get it out there. And so I was led fortuitously to Jennifer, who's very, very skilled, and a beautiful book came forth, I think. Yeah, thank you so much. So any last questions? I'm trying to see, is there any more?
Me, back here.
Norma.
Oh,
I was wondering if you knew about the family drink, which is called a Finkel, and if you do you know the ingredients?
What? Do you know about the family drink called a Finkel?
Finkel.
Finkel, and what are the ingredients?
I have no idea. But I do want to tell you, I want to share something else. Wait for this one. So when my husband and I moved to Cambridge in 1966, and my grandfather had died, but Granby still lived here. I wanted very much to find out about who was Grando. And so I looked up his, what should I say, his most important mentee, who then was a professor in the same department at Harvard, named Richard Schultes. And I went and had lunch with Richard Schultes. And he told me, Oaks, you'll appreciate this story too. He told me, winking at me, he said, your grandfather told us that whenever we went into these countries of Central and South America and Cuba, where they went, my grandfather always looking for new orchids. He said to Richard Schultes and others, if the native peoples, the indigenous peoples, offer you anything, you should take it. Well, you know what that meant? That meant that my grandfather, he probably tried these things like psilocybin and kanna and I don't know, whatever, all these things. And I want you to know, did you want to add?
I can't believe my grandfather
What?
eating a magic mushroom.
Oh, magic mushrooms, yes, magic mushrooms. So because there seems to be a returning interest in this, and I think it's very related, I see heads nodding, I think it's very related to the evolution of consciousness of this planet that people are once again exploring, and Oakes was one of the earliest pioneers. He went down to Mexico, and wasn't it with Maria Sabina? Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, he went with Gordon Wasson, right?
Yeah.
And among the very first people that went to start exploring this. So I want to say, you asked about a drink. This is much more interesting than drink. That it's very clear to me, and one of you told me, was it you, Norma, that there's a poem that Grando's students wrote to him that made it very clear that his students knew that sometimes he was teaching while a little bit on something. I can hear him laughing. I swear it's okay. I'm not going to be struck by lightning. But it feels important. And one of the things, I could go on and on. My own immediate family had secrets. My mother had some nervous breakdowns, and it was some tough stuff that happened. And family secrets are always so corrosive. And I just want to say, in sharing something like this, I think it's wonderful. We need to be open with one another. We need to trust each other. And we need to support each other in whatever journeys we need to do and explore. So anyways, I'm glad I shared that with you. It feels very important. Okay, I think probably we should come to an end. I want to say one more thing. I bought copies of my book. I've got 2 previous books. See, what happened was my beloved husband, Hob, got Alzheimer's, and he was 14 years my elder, so I was sort of catapulted into that world very young. And it led me into writing and teaching. I wrote a book about our journey with his Alzheimer's because he also was an ordained Buddhist teacher. And how he handled it was very inspiring. So that book is there. And then I wrote a book called Aging with Wisdom, which came from being asked to give talks on this topic. And then finally the memoir. So, and then also I want to mention Elizabeth Fidela's book. I don't know, Norma, if there are any copies here? Yes, there are? Oh, good. Okay, so this, I haven't met her personally, but she just finished about a year ago a biography and it's really interesting. It's about the relationship between Blanche and Oakes Ames. It was an amazing working relationship and loving relationship, and they were utterly different people. And so Elizabeth did this research and wrote this book, and there are some copies of that too. So there's a lot of possibilities here. So thank you once again for coming and for being so attentive.